That study, we've got a few more lessons to go, and this one is called Yes, and it's taken from Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. I hope that you've taken the time to read through the book of Joshua. I know there are sections in there that are a little difficult to get through, but in the main, at least kind of the 30,000 flyover view of Joshua, it's a very encouraging book for all of us. So I hope that you've taken the time to do that. But the section that I've kind of carved out today to talk about is Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. And it's not going to come as any surprise to you that I suggest that faith is a choice. And inheritance people like us make that choice. And when forced to stand at the crossroads of belief, let's say, or unbelief, we choose belief. Inheritance people like us, we place one determined step after another in this pathway of faith. Now, granted, we're generally not skipping through life doing that. We usually take those steps more often than not with maybe an occasional limp. We make conscious decisions to take steps toward God, to lean into hope, and to heed the call of heaven. We press into the promises of God, and Joshua's story urges us to do the same. In fact, you could argue that the central message of the entire book of Joshua is this: God keeps his promises. So trust him. Joshua 21, verse 45 said, all came to pass. And these 4 words in 3 verses are really the theological heart of the book of Joshua. They rise up kind of like trumpets, and they end at this narrative. And the narrative and the explanation is, look, don't miss this point. Let me have your attention, everyone. God keeps his promises. God keeps his word. And the writer of the book of Joshua pounds this point in triplicate, because 3 times in 3 verses he declares the following. First, God did what he said he would do. The Lord gave all he had sworn to give. That's verse 43. The Lord gave rest according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. That's verse 44. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken. All came to pass. Verse 45. One commentator was so taken by that last statement, he entitled his study of the book of Joshua as No Falling Words. Because you know as well as I do, we live in a world of falling words. Broken promises, empty vows, pledges made only to be retracted, assurances that have been given to us and then they're ignored. They've all been spoken with great fanfare. I love you. Or count on this company to recognize your hard work. Or till death do us part. But words, unfortunately, tend to tumble and fall. They're autumn leaves in a November's wind. And I'm sure you've heard your share of falling words. But you'll never hear them from God. In a world of falling words, his remain. In a life of broken promises, he keeps his. The Lord's promise is sure, the psalmist says in Psalm chapter 12, verse 6. He speaks no careless word. All he says is purest truth, like silver 7 times refined. You see, the God that we've come here to worship this morning is a covenant-keeping God. He keeps his promises. And if you want proof, the narrator tells us to look at the story. The Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers. That's Joshua chapter 21, verse 43. But specifically, God gave Abraham this promise, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." That was 600 years earlier. And who would have even believed that would have happened? I mean, when Abraham died, the only land he owned was Sarah's cemetery plot. His descendants were sharecroppers at best and slaves at worst in Egypt for over 400 years. Moses led them near, but never into Canaan. And how many sons and daughters of Abraham do you think looked up in the stars and prayed, "God, would you just keep your promise?" And the answer from the pages of Joshua is, "Yes, I will." God promised to bless Abraham, and through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth. In fact, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, it says, "I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, this was a promise that was partially fulfilled in Joshua, but this is a promise that was completely fulfilled in Jesus Christ. In him, all nations are blessed. In Jesus, every person has hope and the possibility of redemption. No wonder the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20 says, "All the promises of God find their yes in Christ Jesus." You see, church, our God is a promise-keeping God. Others might make promises and forget them. But if God makes a promise, he keeps it. In fact, the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 says, "He who promised is faithful." So the question that raises is, well, does that even really matter? I mean, does God's integrity make any difference at all? Does the faithfulness of God ever come into play? Well, if your child is on life support, it does. If you're walking up and down the halls of the emergency room, it does. When you're wondering what to do with every parent's worst nightmare, you have to choose, don't you? Are you going to choose faith, or are you going to choose fear? Are you going to see that God's purpose is purposeful, or is it just random history? A God who knows and cares, or a God who just isn't there? We all choose, all of us. Inheritance people like us believe that God is up to something good, even though all we see sometimes looks bad. They echo the verse of the hymn that we've sung here before. The hymn is called "My Hope is Built." My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, his oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the what? Whelming flood. I think nothing deserves your attention more than God's covenants, his promises. No words written on paper will ever sustain you like God's promises. And here's just a few of them. For instance, to the bereaved, weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. Or to the besieged, let's say, the righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. That's Psalm chapter 34, verse 19. To the sick, the Lord sustains them on their sickbed and restores them from their bed of illness. That's Psalm chapter 41, verse 3. To the lonely, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2. And to the dying, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would not have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. John chapter 14, verse 2. And to the sinners, he says, my grace is sufficient for you. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. See, these promises are for your good and for mine. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4 says, and because of his glory and excellence, he has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share his divine nature and escape the world's corruption caused by human desires. Have you ever thought about that? That by relying and trusting and meditating on the promises of God, it allows you to escape the corruption that's caused by human desires. And in fact, you get to share in God's divinity because you're sharing in his promises. And so the encouragement that Joshua is giving to us and that I'm sharing with you is that we need to press really hard into these promises of God. When fears surface, for instance, well, maybe we should respond with this thought. But God said. And when doubts arise, we can respond by saying, yeah, but God said. And when guilt overwhelms us, we can remind ourselves, yes, but God said. Like the psalmist, we can all declare, Psalm 31, verse 5, you have rescued me, O God, who keeps his promises. Turn again and again and again to the covenants and promises of God. That's what Joshua is reminding us to do. Toward the end of the book, he is going back and asking the children, please look at all the promises that were made to you and how the God that you worship has satisfied each and every one of them. You can trust him. You have in the past, you are in the present, and you can continue to trust him in the future. Turn again and again and again to God's covenants and his promises. Search the scriptures kind of like a gold miner. You just keep digging and digging and digging, and finally when you find that little nugget, you hang on to it because it's so valuable and it speaks to you. You grasp it. You trust it. You might even take it to the bank. You can do what I did with the promise I heard from a pilot. On a flight many years ago, bad weather had come our way, and the flight into Los Angeles was delayed by storms. Unfortunately, we landed in Los Angeles at the exact time the final flight to San Diego was to depart. And as we taxied down to the gate, I'm checking my watch. I'm thinking about hotels. I'm grumbling about the inconvenience and thinking about, man, what a bad break this is. Then over the loudspeaker, I heard this. This is the pilot. I know many of you have connections. Relax. You'll make them. We are holding your planes. We have a place for you. I'm thinking, well, if the pilot says that I'm going to make my connecting flight, well, then I think I should believe the pilot because he would know, right? And so, in deciding to believe the pilot, what did I stop doing? I stopped checking my watch. I stopped feeling ugly and miserable about the fact that I'm going to miss my flight. I stopped thinking about hotels. I stopped thinking about rental cars. I could just relax in the promise of the pilot because he told me I'm going to make my connection. So I marched through the concourse to get to my next gate with absolute confidence and certainty that I was going to make my flight because the pilot had given me a promise. Other people in the airport, unfortunately, that evening were not so fortunate. They weren't on my flight. They didn't hear the promise make a statement to them because they, also victims of inclement weather, were now in a panic, like I was. They're scrambling, they're white-faced, they're worried, their expressions betrayed their fear. Too bad their pilot hadn't spoken to them, don't you think? Or maybe he had, and they just didn't listen. You see, church, your pilot has spoken to you. Are you going to listen to him? I mean, really listen to him. Just let his promises kind of settle over you, kind of like the warmth of a summer day or even an early February day like today. When everything and anything around you says to scream panic, you can choose the path of peace. In this world of the falling words we talked about and broken promises, do yourself a favor. Take hold of the promises of God. One of my favorite pictures that I've shared with this church from time to time is this picture of God working in our lives, especially during the hard times. I have this mental image of God doing needlepoint. Have you ever seen a finished needlepoint? I mean, some of the needlepoints I've seen, they even have as museum pieces. I mean, they are classic works of art. They have it framed and they have it lighted, and it is just absolutely beautiful on the side that you see. But have you ever seen the back of the needlepoint? It is a mess of different colored strings going every which way and a bunch of knots. On this side of heaven, it seems like we stand behind the needlepoint and we only see the knotted ends and we only see the mess of string and the frayed edges of what God is actually doing on the other side. Because if we could only see the other side of the needlepoint, we could see God doing something extraordinarily beautiful. But we live on the backside of the needlepoint with painful circumstances and God's purposes to us sometimes very unclear. Have you ever struggled to believe that God was actually weaving something beautiful in your life? Maybe it was when God gave you a glimpse of the beautiful side of the needlepoint, maybe after a season of staring at the backside. We spend a lot of time, I think, staring at the ugly side of the needlepoint. And maybe if you haven't, you might know someone who is. And the temptation for us in trying to assist others is to see the knotted underside of the needlepoint in a friend or a spouse or maybe even a family member, and then give them encouragement by speculating about what beautiful thing God is doing. I mean, we like to suggest possible, hopeful outcomes to write our own endings in God's story. But that's not particularly helpful, since we don't actually know for sure what God's doing, first of all, even if sometimes we think that we do. But it's also not helpful because it implies that what is needed for us to trust God in the hard times is an understanding of what He's doing, where this particular part of the story fits into the big picture. I'm just telling you, biblically, that's not what God tells us is needed. And for proof, ask Job or ask Joseph. or ask the author of Ecclesiastes. You see, our seeing the needlepoint from God's viewpoint and understanding the whole story is not the answer. God says the answer is to know and to trust the weaver. To know and to trust that he is indeed making something beautiful. That he is in fact a God who redeems and restores even the most broken and hopeless situation. Even when we don't understand why or even how. He actually calls us to live almost exclusively looking at the backside of the needlepoint. And our hope from that side is a trust that there is a beautiful side being created by a master weaver who keeps his promises. In other words, we don't have to tell Jack and Jill that their marital struggles are part of God's grander purpose, or tell Sally how her heartbreak is now going to be redeemed, or tell Bob his failure is going to be made glorious in the collapse of his business. Instead, when those ugly sides of the needlepoint are shared, we can love others well by reminding them of who God is and what he is like as a God who can be trusted to keep his promises, and how much he understands their pain because he experienced it himself on the cross. That is a God that we can trust. That is a weaver who gives us hope from the backside of the needlepoint. The faith that turns to God in the darkest hour and praises God with the weakest body. The kind of faith that trusts in God's promises. The kind of faith that proclaims, yes, faith is a choice, and yes, I choose faith. It's not always easy to do. We live in a society that relies upon science or their own personal beliefs or outcomes to justify whatever their belief system is. And many times, as a Christian, you're going to be challenged because we don't have all the answers. And God never intended us for us to have all the answers. But what God has given us is the opportunity to come alongside others who are looking for answers and explain to them the God that we serve and the God that we love. And perhaps sharing stories with that person about how God got us through that difficulty or that hardship or that heartache. That's how we minister to the people with whom we come into contact. That's why it's so important, as I've said so many times, that you just don't come here to play church. I mean, it's good to come together as a family and worship, absolutely. But your life needs to be affected at a level that you take church with you to the workplace, to the gas station, to the grocery store, to home, to the children. That Christianity is not just something we talk about, not just a label that we wear, but a lifestyle and a commitment and a faith that we choose. And so choosing faith sometimes in this society can be a challenge. You're criticized for a faith in a God that we cannot see. In fact, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We live in a society that's not evidence. If you can't see it, then that's not evidence. But our faith is the substance, the very thing that we hope for, based upon evidence that we cannot see. That is faith. And that's why a world around us challenges us and our sanity if we actually believe that. But I don't see their life helping them. I went to a memorial service in Borrego Springs yesterday, and it was in an Episcopal church. I haven't spent much time in an Episcopal church. It was a beautiful service for the person who had passed. And their way of doing church, so to speak, and their methodologies and their structure and the way that the church is set up is different than this one, but they still believe in God. They still believe in Jesus Christ. So there's so many things about that church with which I can kind of come alongside and understand and appreciate. But what struck me was one of the attendees there looked absolutely lost, almost bewildered, because this loved one had been taken away from them and they didn't have an explanation for it. And not that any of us will have explanations as to why we lose a loved one. Ask Jeannie, ask Mona. But this person didn't have God. And so to put in the context of losing someone that they love so much, without a belief in the God that the decedent was believing in and put their faith in, was almost too much for this person. In fact, when talking about that person, somebody said, yes, he sat at the very back of the church in the very last pew because he was afraid that the church would collapse when he walked through the door. That's how far away he was from God. And you know what? No one is going to know about the God that you worship unless you tell them. But sometimes in the telling of the story, it's not going out and evangelizing. It's allowing your life to be probably the best sermon that that person might ever hear. So this week, as you go about your day, as you go about your life, choose faith and allow that to reflect on others so that they might have the chance to make that choice too. If you have any prayer requests, now would be the time for you to pass them up. We'll pray over those and then we'll be dismissed. But we've selected a song. What's the next one? Standing on the Promises. God's a promise keeper. We can stand on those promises. So Steve's going to lead us in that song. We're going to stand and sing. At the conclusion of that, we'll talk about the prayer requests and we'll be dismissed. Let's stand.